It was a typical evening in the city. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple across the sky. Streets were alive with people heading home from work, grabbing dinner, or simply enjoying the cool night air. Among them was a tall man with broad shoulders wearing a simple hoodie and jeans. He walked briskly down the sidewalk, his hands tucked into his pockets as he hummed a tune to himself. Unbeknownst to him, someone else was watching closely. Officer Greg Miller. Known around the precinct for his no-nonsense attitude, Miller wasn't exactly popular among locals. To some, he came off as stern but fair. To others, he seemed unnecessarily harsh, especially when dealing with people who didn't look like him. On this particular night, Miller was patrolling an area where reports of suspicious activity had trickled in earlier. His eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, searching for anything or anyone that might justify pulling over. That's when he spotted the man in the hoodie walking quickly along the street. Something about his pace caught Miller's attention. Maybe it was how deliberate his steps were, or maybe it was just gut instinct. Whatever it was, Miller decided to investigate further. He slowed his patrol car to a crawl, then pulled over near the curb. "Hey, you there?" Miller called out through the open window of his cruiser. His voice carried authority, loud enough to make heads turn nearby. The man stopped mid-step, turned around, and looked at the officer. There was no panic in his expression, only mild curiosity. "Yes?" the man replied calmly, stepping closer to the car. "Is there something I can help you with?" Miller studied him for a moment before responding. "Do you live around here?" he asked gruffly, leaning slightly out of the window. The man nodded. "Yeah, I do. Just heading back after grabbing some food." For reasons unknown even to himself, Miller felt uneasy. Perhaps it was the calmness in the man's tone, or perhaps it was something deeper, an ingrained bias that often clouded his judgment during encounters like these. Instead of letting it go, Miller pressed on. "Can I see?" "Your ID?" he demanded, his tone sharper now. The request took the man by surprise. He blinked once, then frowned. "Why? Did I do something wrong?" Miller bristled at the question. In his mind, asking why he needed identification was tantamount to defiance. "Just show me your ID," he repeated, his patience wearing thin. "It's standard procedure," but the man stood his ground. "I know my rights," he said firmly, though still composed. "If you don't tell me what I'm being stopped for, I'm not obligated to give you anything." That did it. Something snapped inside Miller. Whether it was frustration, anger, or years of pent-up prejudice boiling over, he couldn't say. All he knew was that he felt disrespected, and in his line of work, disrespect wasn't tolerated. Without another word, Miller stepped out of his car, marched toward the man, and shoved him hard against the hood of the vehicle. "What part of 'show me your ID' don't you understand?" Miller barked, gripping the man's arm tightly. "I told you, I haven't done anything," the man shot back, trying to steady himself. "Let go of me." Things escalated quickly. Words flew back and forth, each one more heated than the last. Passers-by began gathering, sensing trouble brewing. Phones came out, cameras rolling silently. And then, in a flash, Miller drew back his fist and delivered a punch straight to the man's face. The impact sent the man stumbling backward, clutching his cheek. Blood trickled from a small cut near his mouth. Stunned and reeling, he stared up at Miller, unable to believe what had just happened. Around them, murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. Some shouted angrily at Miller, calling him names and accusing him of brutality. Others stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or stay back. And then, amidst the chaos, a voice rang out. A woman's voice, shrill and incredulous. "Do you even know who this is?" Miller froze. For the first time since stepping out of his car, doubt crept into his mind. Everyone was staring at him now, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outright fury. Slowly, reluctantly, he glanced down at the man he'd assaulted, who was now wiping blood from his lip with the back of his hand. That's when it hit him. This wasn't just any random pedestrian. This wasn't some guy walking home after picking up takeout. No, this was someone important, someone powerful, someone whose face had been plastered all over billboards and news headlines for the past 2 years. This was the mayor of the city. Miller's heart sank. Panic surged through him like wildfire. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. All he could do was stand there frozen as the weight of what he'd done crashed down on him like a ton of bricks. The woman's voice echoed in the tense silence that followed. "Do you even know who this is?" she shouted again, her tone laced with disbelief and anger. The crowd murmured louder now, their eyes darting between the officer and the man, on the ground. Some shook their heads in disgust while others looked at Miller as if seeing him for the first time, like he was some kind of monster. Miller blinked rapidly, his mind racing. He glanced down at the man who was still holding his cheek, blood staining his fingers. For a moment, all Miller could see was the hoodie, the casual jeans, the calm demeanor that had triggered something inside him, a mix of irritation and suspicion. But now, as the pieces started falling into place, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "Oh no," Miller muttered under his breath. Though it was loud enough for those closest to hear, his grip on the man's arm loosened completely, and he took an involuntary step back, almost tripping over his own feet. The mayor didn't say anything at first. He simply stared up at Miller, his expression unreadable. There was pain in his eyes, sure, but also something else, something deeper. It wasn't rage or hatred, not yet anyway. It was more like disappointment, the kind that cuts sharper than any insult ever could. Around them, the crowd began to buzz with excitement, or maybe shock would be a better word. People whispered among themselves, pointing fingers and shaking their heads. Someone shouted, "That's the mayor! Are you serious right now?" Another person chimed in, "This cop just assaulted the mayor of the city." The situation spiraled out of control quickly. Phones were held high, capturing every second of the confrontation. Social media lit up within minutes. Hashtags like "Justice for the Mayor" and "Police Accountability" trended almost instantly. News vans arrived before long, their bright lights illuminating the scene like a Hollywood movie set. Reporters shoved microphones toward anyone willing to talk, asking questions about what they saw and how they felt. Meanwhile, Miller stood frozen, his face pale. He knew exactly what this meant, for him, for his career, and possibly even for his freedom. Assaulting a citizen was bad enough, but assaulting the mayor? That was a whole different level of trouble. Every instinct told him to run, to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare. But his legs wouldn't move. All he could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, as the world around him unraveled. Finally, the mayor spoke. His voice was steady, though tinged with pain. "Officer," he said slowly, pausing to catch his breath. "Do you realize what you've done?" Miller swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Sir, I didn't mean," he stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. His hands trembled slightly, and he clenched them into fists to hide it. "You didn't mean to what?" the mayor interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You didn't mean to assume I was suspicious because of how I look? You didn't mean to demand my ID without cause? Or maybe you didn't mean to hit me when I refused to comply?" Each question landed like a hammer blow, forcing Miller to confront the truth. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could he say? Anything he tried to explain would only make things worse, so instead he stayed silent, his head bowed in shame. By now, backup officers had arrived on the scene. They approached cautiously, unsure of how to handle the chaos unfolding before them. One of them gently pulled Miller aside, whispering urgently, in his ear, "Greg, you need to leave now." It wasn't advice, it was an order. But Miller couldn't bring himself to move. His eyes remained locked on the mayor, who was slowly getting to his feet, wincing as he touched his swollen cheek. Despite everything, the mayor carried himself with dignity, standing tall despite the pain. He turned to address the crowd, raising his hand to quiet them. "Listen, everyone," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your concern, but we don't need violence here tonight. Let's let the proper authorities handle this." His words seemed to have the desired effect. The crowd simmered down, though the tension in the air remained thick. Officers ushered Miller into a patrol car, his face hidden behind his hands. As the vehicle drove away, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, desperate for answers. Back at the scene, the mayor took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about accountability, about justice, and about sending a message to the entire city and beyond that no one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. As the night wore on, the story spread like wildfire. By morning, it dominated headlines everywhere. Talk shows debated whether this was an isolated incident or symptomatic of larger issues within law enforcement. Politicians weighed in, calling for investigations and reforms. Activists saw an opportunity to push for change, organizing protests and rallies across the city. For the mayor, however, the hardest part was yet to come. Yes, he'd been wronged, humiliated, and physically hurt. But he also knew that his response to this moment would define not just his legacy, but the future of the city he loved. Could he rise above the anger and pain to seek real, meaningful change? Or would this become another chapter in the endless cycle of injustice? Only time would tell. The sun rose the next morning, casting golden light over the city skyline. But for the mayor and everyone else involved in the incident, there was no peace to be found. Social media hadn't slept. It buzzed relentlessly with outrage, memes, and heated debates. News outlets ran nonstop coverage, replaying the viral footage of the altercation from every angle. The video showed everything: the officer's aggressive tone, the punch that landed without warning, and the stunned faces of bystanders as they realized who the victim was. By breakfast time, protests were already forming outside City Hall. People held up signs reading "No justice, no peace," and "Accountability now." Some chanted slogans while others stood silently, holding candles or pictures of past victims of police brutality. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about years of frustration boiling over. For many, this incident felt like the final straw. Inside City Hall, the mayor sat alone in his office, staring at the wall. His cheek still ached where he'd been hit, but it wasn't the physical pain that weighed on him. It was the emotional toll, the betrayal, the anger, the sheer disbelief that something like this could happen to him, of all people. After all, he'd spent 2 years working tirelessly to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. He'd listened to countless stories of injustice, pushed for reforms, and even attended ride-alongs with officers to better understand their challenges. And yet here he was, sitting in his own office, nursing an injury caused by one of the very people he'd tried so hard to support. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from reporters, colleagues, friends, and strangers offering both sympathy and criticism. One message stood out. It was from his wife, who had been out of town when the incident occurred. Her voice trembled with emotion as she said, "Are you okay? Please tell me you're okay." He wanted to reassure her to say yes, but how could he? Physically, maybe. Emotionally, not even close. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His chief of staff walked in, looking exhausted. "Sir," she began cautiously, "we need to talk about your statement." He nodded slowly. "I know," he replied, rubbing his temples. "What do we say?" She hesitated before answering. "People are angry, not just because of what happened to you, but because they see themselves in this moment. They want answers. They want action." The mayor leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. She was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. Every word he said, or didn't say, would carry weight. If he came across as too forgiving, critics would accuse him of going soft. If he sounded too vengeful, others might call it hypocrisy, given his history of advocating for reconciliation. After a long pause, he spoke. "We'll address the public today," he decided. "But I'm not going to focus on punishment. This is bigger than one bad cop. We need to use this moment to push for real change." His chief of staff nodded approvingly. "That's smart. People will respect that." Later that afternoon, the mayor stepped onto the steps of City Hall, flanked by members of his team. Cameras flashed wildly as reporters shouted questions from below. When he finally raised his hand to signal silence, the crowd obeyed, eager to hear what he had to say. "Last night, I experienced something that no one should ever have to endure," he began, his voice steady despite the storm swirling inside him. "But let me be clear. I am not here to ask for pity. What happened to me is unacceptable, yes, but so are the countless other injustices faced by people in our community every single day." The crowd erupted into applause, some nodding in agreement while others wiped away tears. He waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "This is a wake-up call, for me, for our police department, and for everyone who cares about justice. We cannot move forward unless we hold ourselves accountable. That means transparency, consequences for wrongdoing, and meaningful reforms that protect everyone equally." As he spoke, his words resonated far beyond the gathered crowd. Live streams of his speech went viral, reaching millions. Supporters praised his grace under pressure, calling him a true leader. Critics, however, weren't entirely satisfied. Some argued that talking about reform wasn't enough. They wanted immediate action. Others questioned whether he was being too lenient, urging him to demand harsher penalties for the officer involved. Behind the scenes, the fallout continued. Officer Greg Miller, now suspended pending investigation, became the face of everything wrong with policing in America. Inc. leagues distanced themselves from him, afraid of guilt by association. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs launched a full-scale review of his record, uncovering troubling patterns of misconduct stretching back years. Anonymous tips poured in from citizens claiming similar experiences with Miller during traffic stops or public encounters. Each new detail added fuel to the fire. For the mayor, the days following the incident were a blur. Meetings stretched late into the night as he worked with advisors to draft plans for sweeping reforms. Community leaders joined him at roundtable discussions, sharing ideas on how to rebuild trust between residents and law enforcement. Activists pushed for body cameras on all officers, stricter oversight committees, and mandatory bias training programs. Even opponents of reform found themselves forced to engage in the conversation, knowing the eyes of the nation were watching. At home, though, the mayor struggled privately. His family urged him to take a step back, fearing for his mental and physical health. "You've done enough," his wife told him one evening, gripping his hand tightly. "Let someone else handle this for once." But he shook his head. "If I don't lead, who will?" he asked quietly. "This isn't just my fight, it's everyone's." Despite the chaos surrounding him, he refused to give up. Deep down, he believed in the possibility of change. Yes, the road ahead would be difficult, and yes, not everyone would agree with his approach. But if there was even a chance to turn this tragedy into progress, he owed it to himself and to the city he loved to try. The courtroom was packed to the brim, every seat filled, every corner occupied. Reporters with notepads scribbled furiously, cameras rolled silently in the back, and spectators whispered nervously among themselves. The air felt heavy, charged, with tension that made it hard to breathe. This wasn't just another trial. It was a spectacle, a moment of reckoning for an entire system under scrutiny. Officer Greg Miller sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and drawn. He looked smaller than he had on the viral video, almost fragile. His uniform was gone, replaced by a plain suit that didn't quite fit right. Beside him, his lawyer shuffled through papers, occasionally leaning over to whisper something in his ear. But Miller barely responded. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding the stares of those who'd come to witness his fate. On the other side of the aisle sat the mayor. He walked in calmly, dressed in a crisp shirt and tie, his bruised cheek still faintly visible despite efforts to cover it with makeup. People stood as he entered, clapping softly in solidarity. He nodded in acknowledgement but didn't smile. There was no triumph in his expression, only determination. For him, this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. As the proceedings began, the prosecution laid out its case. They played the viral footage again, frame by painful frame. The judge instructed the jury to focus on the facts, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of what they were watching. The officer's harsh words echoed through the courtroom. followed by the sickening thud of his fist connecting with the mayor's face. Gasps rippled through the crowd when the punch landed, even though most people had already seen it online, dozens of times. But the footage wasn't the only evidence presented. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Bystanders who'd recorded the incident, fellow officers who'd worked alongside Miller, and community members who'd interacted with him in the past. Each testimony painted a clearer picture of a man whose behavior had gone unchecked for far too long. One woman recounted how Miller had pulled her over late at night for no apparent reason, berating her in front of her children before letting her go without explanation. Another described being handcuffed during a routine traffic stop simply because he didn't like her attitude. A former colleague revealed that complaints against Miller had been brushed aside multiple times, often dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerated claims. Miller's lawyer tried to argue that his client had acted out of fear, claiming the mayor's refusal to comply escalated the situation. But the argument fell flat. Even some of the jurors exchanged skeptical glances, their expressions saying more than words ever could. For Miller, sitting through all of this was torture. Every story, every accusation felt like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. He wanted to defend himself, to explain why he'd done what he did. But how could he justify something he barely understood himself? Was it racism? Fear? Or just years of bad habits catching up to him? Whatever the truth was, it gnawed at him, constantly, keeping him awake at night. Meanwhile, the mayor found himself grappling with his own emotions. On the surface, he remained composed, answering questions from the stand with calm precision. But inside, he was anything but okay. Reliving the incident brought back memories he'd rather forget. The sting of the punch, the shock of realizing who the officer thought he was dealing with, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in his own city. At home, things weren't much better. His wife noticed the toll it was taking on him. Some nights she'd find him sitting alone in the dark, staring off into space. Other times he'd snap at small things, frustrated by the slow grind of justice. "It's eating you alive," she said one evening, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You can't keep carrying all of this by yourself." "I don't have a choice," he replied quietly. "If I let go now, what happens to everyone else? What happens to the next person who gets stopped for no reason?" She didn't have an answer for that. Outside the courtroom, the city buzzed with anticipation. Protesters gathered daily, demanding accountability not just for Miller but for the larger issues his actions represented. Activists held rallies, calling for systemic changes within law enforcement. Politicians scrambled to align themselves with reform efforts, sensing the shifting winds of public opinion. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Enough is enough" and "Change Now," amplifying voices that had long been ignored. Back in court, closing arguments arrived sooner than anyone expected. The prosecutor delivered a passionate speech, urging the jury to see the bigger picture. "This isn't just about one officer," she said, her voice steady yet fierce. "It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it." Miller's lawyer countered by appealing to sympathy, arguing that his client was just one man making a mistake in the heat of the moment. But his words lacked conviction, and the jury seemed unconvinced. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the verdict came down: guilty. Assault charges stuck, along with additional counts related to misconduct and abuse of power. As the judge announced the sentence, 5 years in prison plus mandatory bias training upon release, a wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Cheers erupted from supporters, while others sat silently, reflecting on the gravity of the moment. For Miller, the world crumbled around him. Shackles clicked into place as bailiffs led him away, his head bowed low. For the mayor, relief washed over him. But it was bittersweet. Justice had been served, yes, but at what cost? Lives had been disrupted, trust shattered, and wounds opened wide. Yet even amidst the chaos there was hope. Hope that this verdict would spark real change. Hope that the city could heal. And hope that maybe, just maybe, lessons learned here could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the confines of the courtroom. The courtroom emptied slowly after the verdict. Reporters rushed outside to file their stories, while supporters lingered behind, hugging one another and sharing quiet words of relief. For many, this moment felt like a turning point, a rare victory in a long fight for justice. But for the mayor, it was just the beginning of a much harder journey. The trial may have ended, but the scars it left behind would take far longer to heal. That evening, the mayor stood on his balcony overlooking the city skyline. The lights twinkled below, casting a warm glow over streets that had been filled with protests only days before. Now they were quieter, almost peaceful. His wife joined him, handing him a cup of tea. She didn't say anything at first, letting the silence stretch between them. Finally, she broke it. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked softly. He sighed, gripping the railing tightly. "Enough for what? Enough to fix everything that's broken? No, it'll never be enough for that. But it's a start." And he meant it. While the guilty verdict brought some measure of closure, he knew deep down that real change wouldn't come from locking up one bad officer. It required something bigger, something deeper. People wanted action, not just words. They wanted proof that things could actually get better. The next morning, the mayor called an emergency meeting with city council members, police chiefs, and community leaders. The room buzzed with energy as everyone took their seats. Some looked hopeful, others skeptical. He opened the discussion by acknowledging the elephant in the room. "We've got two choices," he said firmly. "We can let yesterday's verdict divide us further, or we can use it as a chance to rebuild trust. Which path do we choose?" His question sparked a lively debate. Community activists pushed for sweeping reforms, body cameras on every officer, independent oversight committees, stricter consequences for misconduct. Police representatives argued for more resources, insisting that proper training and support could prevent future incidents. At times, tempers flared and voices rose, but the mayor kept steering the conversation back to solutions. "This isn't about picking sides," he reminded them. "It's about finding common ground." By the end of the day, they had drafted a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward. New policies would require officers to wear body cameras at all times, with footage reviewed regularly for accountability. A civilian review board would be established to handle complaints against law enforcement, ensuring investigations remained transparent. Mandatory bias training programs would become standard practice, focusing not just on theory, but real-world scenarios designed to challenge ingrained prejudices. And perhaps most importantly, funding would increase for community outreach initiatives aimed at fostering dialogue between residents and police. News of the reform spread quickly, earning praise from some quarters and criticism from others. Critics accused the mayor of being too soft, arguing that these measures didn't go far enough. Supporters, however, saw them as a meaningful effort to address systemic issues head-on. Either way, the conversation kept going, and that, the mayor believed, was progress. Meanwhile, Officer Greg Miller began serving his sentence. Prison life hit him hard. Used to authority and control, he now found himself stripped of both. Days blurred together in a haze of monotony, punctuated by moments of reflection forced upon him by mandatory counseling sessions. At first, he resisted, brushing off therapists' questions and refusing to engage. But over time, something shifted. Maybe it was the weight of guilt pressing down on him. Or maybe it was the realization that he couldn't undo what he'd done, but he could try to understand why he'd done it. During one particularly raw session, the therapist asked him a simple, yet piercing question. "Why do you think you reacted the way you did that night?" Miller hesitated, staring at the floor. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Fear, I guess, anger. I thought I was doing my job, but looking back, I see how wrong I was." "Wrong about what?" The therapist pressed gently. "Everything," Miller replied, his voice cracking. "Who I am, what I stand for, how I treat people. It's like I spent so long seeing the world one way that I stopped questioning whether it was right. It wasn't an excuse. It was an admission." For the first time, Miller allowed himself to confront the biases he'd carried. For years, it wasn't easy. There were days when shame overwhelmed him, leaving him paralyzed. Other days, anger bubbled to the surface, directed at himself as much as anyone else. But slowly, painfully, he started piecing together a new version of who he wanted to be. Word of Miller's efforts leaked out during a routine update on his case. Some dismissed it as a PR stunt, accusing him of trying to win sympathy. Others saw it differently. One activist tweeted, "Change starts with owning your mistakes. If even one person learns from this, it's worth it." The tweet went viral, sparking conversations about redemption and second chances. Inspired by the feedback, the mayor made a bold decision. Against the advice of his team, he requested a private visit with Miller in prison. When the news broke, reactions were mixed. Some praised his willingness to extend forgiveness, calling it a powerful gesture. Others accused him of undermining justice, saying it sent the wrong message. But the mayor didn't waver. "This isn't about me," he told reporters. "It's about showing that growth is possible, even in the hardest places." The meeting took place in a small, sterile room. Miller sat across from the mayor, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Then, quietly, the mayor broke the silence. "I'm not here to lecture you," he began. "I'm here because I believe people can change, if they're willing to face the truth." Miller nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he choked out. "I wish I could take it back." "I know," the mayor replied, simply, "but you can't. What you can do is learn from it. Use this time to figure out how to be better, for yourself, for others, for the world." They talked for nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from personal responsibility to societal expectations. By the end, both men looked drained but lighter, somehow, as if sharing the weight of their pain had lessened its burden. When the mayor left the prison later that day, reporters swarmed him, eager for details. He offered only a brief statement. Today wasn't about answers. It was about asking questions and listening to the responses. Back in the city, reactions varied. Some criticized the meeting as premature, arguing that forgiveness should come after genuine transformation, not before. Others applauded the mayor's courage, calling it a model for how society might approach reconciliation moving forward. For the mayor, though, the visit reinforced his belief in humanity's capacity for growth. Yes, the road ahead remained uncertain. Yes, there would be setbacks along the way. But if even one person walked away inspired to reflect, to listen, to grow, then the effort was worth it. Months passed and the city began to settle into a new rhythm. The protests faded, replaced by quieter yet more meaningful conversations about change. People gathered in community centers, coffee shops, and parks to discuss what accountability truly meant, not just for law enforcement but for everyone. Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, but small steps forward added up over time. The mayor's reforms started showing results almost immediately. Body cameras became standard issue for officers, and their footage was reviewed weekly by both supervisors and members of the Civilian Oversight Board. Complaints against police dropped significantly, partly because officers knew they were being watched, but also because residents felt safer reporting issues without fear of retaliation. Mandatory bias training sessions proved eye-opening for many officers, sparking honest discussions about ingrained stereotypes and how to overcome them. In neighborhoods once divided by mistrust, relationships began to mend. Officers participated in community events, block parties, school programs, even basketball games with local kids. At first, some residents stayed away, still wary of uniforms that reminded them of past injustices. But as interactions grew more frequent and more positive, barriers slowly came down. One mother told reporters she'd never thought she'd let her son shake hands with an officer, let alone laugh and play ball alongside one. "Change takes time," she said, smiling, faintly, "but I think we're heading in the right direction." For the mayor, these moments made all the late nights and tough decisions worth it. He attended town hall meetings regularly, listening to concerns from every corner of the city. Some people thanked him for his leadership. Others vented frustrations, accusing him of moving too slowly or not doing enough. He welcomed both responses. Knowing criticism was part of progress. If no one's pushing back, then I'm probably coasting, he joked during one particularly heated meeting. The crowd laughed despite themselves, easing the tension just enough to keep the conversation going. Meanwhile, Officer Greg Miller continued working on himself behind bars. His transformation didn't happen overnight. It couldn't. But each day brought new insights, new realizations about the person he used to be and the person he wanted to become. Counseling sessions turned into opportunities for growth rather than punishment. He read books recommended by his therapist, wrote letters reflecting on his mistakes, and even volunteered for programs aimed at helping inmates reintegrate into society after release. When Miller finally walked out of prison 5 years later, he looked like a different man. Physically, he'd aged, his hair grayer, his face lined with stress. But emotionally, he seemed lighter, freer. Reporters swarmed him outside the gates, eager for sound bites. Instead of ducking away, Miller stopped and faced them head-on. "I know I can't undo what I did," he said, his voice steady but humble. "But I want to spend the rest of my life making amends, for myself, for the people I hurt, and for anyone who might benefit from learning from my mistakes." His words resonated deeply. Some dismissed them as empty promises, while others saw genuine sincerity. Either way, Miller kept showing up. He accepted invitations to speak at schools, churches, and community forums, sharing his story openly and honestly. He talked about the biases he'd carried, the harm he'd caused, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. It wasn't easy. There were moments when shame threatened to pull him under, but he pushed through, determined to make a difference. One of his most impactful talks took place at a high school career day. A group of teenagers sat slouched in their chairs, clearly uninterested until Miller began speaking. "When I was your age, I thought I had it all figured out," he admitted, pacing slowly across the stage. "I thought being a cop meant having power, authority, respect. What I didn't understand was that true strength comes from humility, from recognizing your flaws and working to fix them." The students listened intently, some nodding along, others scribbling notes. Afterward, a young girl approached him timidly. "Do you think someone like me could ever trust a cop again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miller knelt down so they were eye level. "Not all cops are bad," he replied gently. "And not all are perfect. But if we keep talking, keep holding each other accountable, then yes, I believe trust is possible." Her eyes widened slightly as if considering the idea for the first time. Then she smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a start nonetheless. Back in the city, the mayor watched these developments closely. Though he'd long since moved on from office, leaving behind a legacy of reform and resilience, he remained involved in advocacy work. He often crossed paths with Miller at events, and though their relationship remained complicated, there was mutual respect between them. They weren't friends exactly, but allies in a shared mission to create a better future. Years later, when asked about his proudest accomplishment, the mayor didn't point to policies or headlines. "My greatest victory," he said simply, "was proving that change is possible, even in the hardest places. We didn't fix everything, and we still have work to do. But if we can look back and say we tried, if we can inspire others to try, too, then maybe that's enough." As for Miller, he found purpose in his second chance. He worked as a counselor for at-risk youth, using his experiences to guide kids away from anger and toward understanding. His office walls were covered in thank-you notes and drawings from grateful families, reminders that even broken pieces could be put back together in meaningful ways. The city itself transformed over time, becoming a model for others grappling with similar challenges. Its story spread far beyond its borders, inspiring communities nationwide to tackle injustice with courage and compassion. And though scars remained, visible reminders of pain endured, they served as testaments to resilience, proof that healing was always within reach if people chose to fight for it. In the end, the punch that shocked a nation became more than just a moment of outrage. It became a catalyst for growth, a reminder that even in darkness light could emerge, if only we dared to seek it.